We will definitely talk about the history of the British monarchy under Victoria at a slightly later stage. Let us now finish with Victoria's father, Edward, the Duke of Kent, one of the younger sons of George III. He also had a long-time mistress, however they did not have children together, but when Princess Charlotte died, like his brother William, he had to leave his mistress and find a proper German princess to marry. You may remember poor Prince Leopold, the widower of Charlotte. Don't forget him completely, he will return. For now, let me tell you, he became quite successful in the world, although he never became the consort of the Queen of England. He was invited to the throne of a new country that was forming in Europe in the early 30s, that is Belgium. He was the first king of the Belgians. As I told you, he came from a family that produced pretty people. He had at least one brother and one sister. They are important. The sister became the German princess who was introduced to the Duke of Kent and whom he married. She was a widow. She was a young widow with 2 children, so this was to ensure that she could have more children, and soon enough they had a baby, and this baby was future Queen Victoria. Unfortunately, when she was still a toddler, Edward, the Duke of Kent, her father, who was by all accounts a very healthy, sturdy man with military experience, so it wasn't very expected that he would catch something and die, but this is exactly what happened. He caught the chill developed into pneumonia, he died. So Victoria, at the age, I think she wasn't even 2 years old then, was left an orphan with her mother, now the Duchess of Kent, also called Victoria. Actually, Victoria got the name after her mother. They were supported mostly by Prince Leopold, so the Duchess's brother, who understood the importance of this child and wanted Victoria to be raised in England. They lived in Kensington Palace. The Duchess had a close and somewhat controversial relation with her own private secretary, called Sir John Conroy. This will be something that Victoria will remember as the problems of her childhood. She didn't have a good relationship with her mother, partially because she believed that the Duchess was influenced by Conroy too much. But we will return to Victoria later on, because there are so many other interesting aspects of the Regency period, or the pre-Victorian part of the 19th century to discuss. So if you want more, Lucy Worsley, definitely. But just to indicate, first of all, there is of course the outcome of the revolution and the war with France, culminating in the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo by a coalition led by the great military commander, the Duke of Wellington, who would also have a splendid political career. He was the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister for a time. So he was not only a military man, he was not only good on the battlefield, he was also very good in Parliament. The Prince Regent, because it all happens during the Regency, 1815, Waterloo, this is like the height of the Regency period. Prince Regent was a very great admirer of Napoleon, even though he was his political enemy. He collected all kinds of memorabilia, like when there was a work of art or a piece of valuable furniture or anything else that belonged to Napoleon, George would buy it. When finally there was a time for his own coronation, he really insisted to make it as similar to Napoleon's coronation as possible. So that's quite an interesting side remark. And generally the treatment of Napoleon in British culture and British media of this time is interesting, because of course he was an enemy who had to be defeated, but many historians say he was the last of the, let's say, noble enemies, the kind of enemy whose defeat ennobles you even more. He was not like a vermin, he was not like, you know, the almost unhuman enemy that you might remember from, let's say, the war propaganda before the First World War and before the Second World War. No, he was the noble enemy. So the defeat of Napoleon was the defeat of someone great, someone powerful and important. This is something quite different. What else happens? As you probably recall from last week, the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization, the urbanization, they develop all the time. So by the time Victoria comes to the throne, the everyday effects of the industrialization and urbanization are very, very visible. So what we have is the rapid growth of industrial cities, with quite a lot of problems it created, especially for the working class. The working conditions are bad. There is a lot of unemployment. There is a threat of starvation. There are some, I would say, natural disasters that influence the economy, like the year without the summer, which was in 1816, so just after the defeat of Napoleon, just after the period of blockade of Britain, which caused famine, or at least shortages of food, because, well, Britain is an island, they couldn't trade with continental Europe because of the sea blockade by the French. And in 1816 a volcano erupted somewhere on the other side of the earth, but the eruption was so big that it influenced the climate, causing the year 1816 to be called a year without a summer. The crops failed, there was a threat of famine once again. There were some economical innovations, let's put it this way, concerning agriculture. First of all, the enclosures, so the dismantling of small farms and the transformation of small farms into bigger ones. So of course those who only had small farms had to leave them and migrate to cities and mostly join the workforce, the industrial workforce. This caused quite a lot of unrest among the people, and if you watch Lucy Worsley documentary, you will see there is some cultural, literary response to that as well, in the works of the so-called peasant poet John Clare, who was from the, let's say, folk background, and he wrote in his poetry quite a lot about the sad situation of the people living in in villages after the enclosures. What else? We have the political unrest leading to something I mentioned already, the Luddites revolt, so the kind of rebellion, not an organized rebellion, but let's say the resistance of the people who were opposing the industrialization, and the petitioning for reform, which led to some dramatic moments like Peterloo massacre in Manchester. So the brutal pacification of a peaceful demonstration of the people who wanted political reform. So there are problems, there are serious problems if you think about that. But at the same time, this is the period when the middle class is getting richer, when the lifestyle is becoming quite elegant for those who could afford it. If we think of Regency art and Regency life, let's say, what comes to mind is the cities, the spa towns like Bath and Cheltenham and Leamington. Some of them were quite old, like Bath, which was a spa town ever since the Roman times, but in the 18th century and still in the Regency period, it's the most elegant place to go, and the elegant people, the aristocracy, but also the upper middle class, go there to enjoy themselves, to enjoy the waters, to enjoy the assembly rooms where you could meet people and dance. There are new fashionable dances like the waltz, which was very scandalous because you actually danced in very close proximity with your partner. It wasn't a group dance like the dances popular in the 18th century. It was a dance in pairs, so a man could embrace the woman and kind of whirl together. Very, very scandalous thing, but everybody loved it. Even Queen Victoria loved it. If you want more on that, there is another Lucy Worsley documentary called Dancing Cheek to Cheek, and one of the episodes, there are 3 episodes, is about the waltz. So if you are interested in dancing and you'd like to know more about the waltz, watch this documentary as well. But first of all, watch the Regency documentary. Then we have the Grand Tour. This is something that developed earlier. It was very popular among the aristocracy and generally the rich in the 18th century. It was the idea that after completing the education, young people would, mostly young men, but increasingly this could include young women as well, would travel to continental Europe. So usually they would go to France, then through Switzerland to Italy, sometimes to Greece, sometimes they would go as far as Constantinople, now Istanbul, or Egypt even. They would just go and see the remains of classical cultures. Italy was the most important part of the Grand Tour. The young people, very often accompanied by a tutor, so someone who would explain to them and basically make sure they not only enjoyed themselves but learned something. They would visit the ruins of classical buildings. They would visit the museums and see the old master paintings. They would visit the beautiful cities with beautiful architecture like Venice and Florence and Rome. They would just enjoy all that. For many young people, the traveling through the mountains of Switzerland was a memorable moment. This is something that influences the culture, because when the war with France starts and Britain is blockaded, so nobody can travel freely to the continent, people start discovering the English countryside. They start to look for similar landscapes, the picturesque landscapes in England or in the British Isles as the ones they heard about or they remembered from the Grand Tour. This is the moment when tourism really begins in Britain, and there are some areas that attract most tourists, like the Lake District, which is probably the top tourist spot, but other areas with dramatic landscapes with mountains and lakes. So Wales, parts of Wales, northern Wales especially, and Scotland. This is the moment when Scotland becomes a fashionable place to visit, not a backward country. One of the reasons for that is the popularity of the novels of Sir Walter Scott. Another great favourite of the Prince Regent. He read the books. He wasn't that bad really. He loved good books. He became so fascinated with Scotland that he asked Sir Walter Scott to organise a royal visit in 1822 so King George IV could go to Scotland. He could see Edinburgh. This was a very influential city, intellectually as well. It was called the New Athens sometimes. So they would visit it, and of course tourism followed. So we have the rediscovery of the English countryside, of the English picturesque. This is also strengthened by the painters. We have two great painters in this period, William Turner and John Constable, and both of them painted the English countryside. They painted various areas in England, especially John Constable became the kind of painter of the patriotic landscape of Britain. So his works show the beauty of mostly Sussex. This is where he was from, and he was the son of a mill owner, so he knew the landscape of fields and canals and such. So his paintings really show that nothing spectacular, not like Turner. Turner liked the spectacular in nature, so he would paint dramatic mountains and such thing, but Constable drew the people's attention to the countryside that was being transformed by the Industrial Revolution. So it has this kind of nostalgic air to it, which made Constable very, very popular. So that's what we have. We have neoclassicism, which starts, of course, in the 18th century, but it continues absolutely into the Regency. This is the time when people admire classical sculpture, they admire classical architecture. Some of the great treasures of classical antiquity are in London, like the Elgin marbles, that were the marble sculptures. Not complete, sometimes shattered, but you could still see their greatness, taken from the Parthenon in Athens. So now it's a big problem because Greece wants them back, and they are in the British Museum, and of course the British Museum doesn't want to give them back. So, but in the early 19th century, this was something everybody wanted to see and everybody got inspired by. If we look at the fashion of Regency, those elevated waistlines, those flowing white gowns, they are all inspired by classical antiquity, or at least a kind of reworking, reinterpretation of classical costumes, perhaps a little bit updated to the northern climate, but still they weren't very, very warm. This is the world of Jane Austen. So if we think Regency in Britain, we think Jane Austen. So the world of the rising importance of the middle class, of elegance and flirtation and romance, but at the same time rather harsh conditions for women. If you remember, I don't know, Sense and Sensibility, the problem, the beginning of Sense and Sensibility is that widow cannot inherit property. The property goes to the next male relative, and the widow with 2 daughters has to take a smaller lodging, and if the girls do not find husbands, they basically face destitution. This was the problem really in the 19th century still. And if you think of Pride and Prejudice, we have a family, you might call them kind of very poor gentry, but verging, let's say, on the middle class. They have daughters, they only have daughters, and getting those daughters married is really the way to secure their livelihood. It's not a question of romance, it's not a question of personal happiness, it's the question of the survival of the family. So this is something that is sometimes overshadowed by the elegance and good manners and pretty architecture and pretty music and dances of the Regency period. But this was in fact, I would say, socially and politically quite a harsh moment. Yeah, we continue in a moment.